which involves playing music and administering therapeutic touch at the bedside, did have a slight beneficial health effect. Volunteers who received MIT therapy, researchers found, had less emotional distress before their procedure and a slightly lower mortality rate 6 months after admission. Mitchell Krukoff, the Duke University cardiologist who led the study, says the research, sponsored by several medical centers and foundations, was not intended to provide a definitive answer to the question of whether prayer works. Well, why not? The study, he says, was mostly intended to determine the best way to evaluate the influence of prayer. This is still very fertile ground, but not all scientists agree. Research on prayer during the last decade has been highly controversial. Most studies have focused on so-called intercessory prayer, petitions made directly on behalf of someone else, as opposed to patients praying for their own health. While some studies have found measurable clinical effects, critics say they are often riddled with statistical flaws. The results of others have been too ambiguous to draw conclusions. Some prayer studies are difficult to interpret. For example, when researchers at the University of New Mexico looked at the effect of prayer on recovering alcoholics, they found that patients who knew they were being prayed for actually wound up drinking significantly more.
And can you blame them?
At the end of the 6-month study. Quote, nobody disputes that religious practices bring comfort to people in times of illness, end quote, says Richard Sloan, a professor of behavioral medicine at Columbia University in New York and frequent critic of prayer research. The question is, can medicine add anything to that? It trivializes the religious experience to think you can subject it to the measurement of science. Even researchers who study prayer concede that the discipline is fraught with potential pitfalls. In the standard clinical trial of a new drug, for example, researchers carefully monitor how much medicine a volunteer receives. But how do you define a dose of prayer, Sloan asks, and how do you measure what people are really praying for? What they're saying when they pray. Not that it matters because it really doesn't mean anything.
Let me see. In other words, it's necessary to remind God to be compassionate about the sick.
Apparently, we humans have to tell God what to do.
Because he apparently isn't clever enough to understand that, that some of his own creations are suffering.
And, I don't know, God is too busy. I mean, this gets into silly talk. I don't want to really go down there because it is silly, but...
Unfortunately, I do.
But the reason why we're even talking about this, the reason why there are studies, if you ask me, my opinion is that religion, it can no longer convince people of its benefits of theology. It must show that it is beneficial in some way to people, that it deserves government support. It deserves, people should support it and respect it and get involved in it somehow. And theology just doesn't work. So they have to show that.
Well, the thing is, too, is that, as we have certainly been discussing over the last several shows, that, where religion makes existential claims, about some kind of divine, supernatural interaction with the real world, these are testable, or should be testable by science, and it never, it never comes up. And they always try to use the, well, it's ambiguous thing as an excuse not to discount it. And but not only about in the issue of prayer, but just generally, anybody has a right to believe what they want to believe, to have a house of worship, to preach whatever. But when you bring religion, your religious views into public discussion as fact, they deserve to be criticized, and they should be criticized like any other idea.
But the Christian Science Church, the Christian Science Sanatorium, receives like $10 million a year through Medicare payments for their people who just pray over the sick. This is where this is a real issue, folks.
Yes.
Okay, and those people, unfortunately, they die, or they get, before they die, they're taken out of those sanatoriums, out of the hospital, so they're not recorded.
This is what I was told by someone who actually used to work at a hospice, I think, in Boston.
Right.
But that's, it's word of mouth. But
right. So it's important that we try and show this. I mean, it's like it's trying to nail Jello to the wall. Yeah. You're trying to prove something which we know is not true, because there are no gods to hear the prayers, to get involved. We know this. So so these kind of studies are just, they're just ridiculous.
Yeah, we should be wasting time.
It's like it's trying to prove that, pink unicorns are somehow, involved. Invisible pink unicorns are somehow involved. And let's do a study to see if we can see if they listen to us talking to them and respond to it. I mean, that's to me what this is all about.
Mine listens to me, so I don't need a study. So.
Dennis.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what do you think? Send us your emails. We'd like to have your questions and
Send us your unicorns.
And your comments. Send us your God. Send us your, whatever, but don't send us your prayers.
Right.
Okay. Thank you for joining us on the Atheist Viewpoint. We hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you, Dennis. And thank you, Tim, who's been behind the camera all day doing a fantastic job. We'll see you next week.